This video is sponsored by Card Kingdom. You can visit their store by using my referral link in the description below. Hi everyone, I'm Nitsahone, and it's Monday, so that means it's time for another MTG Top 10, the series where I rank cards based on their historical performance at Magic's highest level of competition. One of the recurring themes in the MTG Top 10s of 2021 has been a look at some of the more aggressive stat lines in Magic. I've looked at things like 1 mana 2/1s, 1 mana 2/2s, and 2 mana 3/3s, and in this video I'm continuing that trend with a look at 4 mana 5/5s. A 5/5 is pretty impressive for only 4 mana, and in Magic's older days it was deemed so good that 4 mana 5/5s usually came with some significant downside. Though, as we'll see, these days we get them with upside on a somewhat regular basis. It isn't a stat line we see a whole lot of though. Only 39 4 mana 5/5s have ever been printed, but the ones that do get printed stand a pretty good chance of seeing some play. Of that 39, 16 of them have at least 1 point using my scoring system. And in this video, we'll take a look at the 10 4 mana 5/5s that have left the biggest impact on competitive Magic. Before we get started, here's a quick reminder on how I score cards in these videos. A top 8 at a Pro Tour, Players Tour, Mythic Championship, Mythic Invitational, Legacy, or Vintage Championship is worth 2 points, and a top 8 at a Magic Fest or Grand Prix is worth 1 point. At number 10, it is Iwamori of the Open Fist. This 4 mana 5/5 comes with the additional upside of Trample, but he also comes with some rather hefty downside. If your opponent has a legendary creature in the hand, they can just put it onto the battlefield. Of course, the flip side of that is if they don't have a legendary creature in their hand, you get a super efficient creature that will leave the opponent dead in just a few turns. Iwamori was played in the sideboard in Standard and can be brought in against opponents who just didn't have any legendary creatures in their decks. It was especially effective against combo decks like Heartbeat of Spring, which really only ran a single legendary creature, Maga, Betrayer of Mortals, and if your opponent put that into play for free, you didn't have much to worry about. Iwamori could end the game well before Heartbeat combo decks could really get going. Unfortunately for Iwamori, as creature power creep has continued, there are plenty of other 4 mana 5/5s available that don't have such a risky downside. As a result, he hasn't gained any points since 2006. At number 9, it is JUZUM Jin, the game's very first 4 mana 5/5 and certainly one of the most iconic ones around. In fact, it is one of the most iconic cards in the game, period. This is partly a result of its incredible art, but it was also thought of as the strongest creature in all of Magic in the game's very early days, usurping that title from Serra Angel. While he didn't have flying or vigilance, JUZUM Jin did cost 1 less and it had better stats than the Angel. Of course, the downside here is that the Jin will damage you every turn, but if you are swinging for 5 every turn, that's obviously not going to matter too much. JUZUM Jin was played in black decks during Magic's early competitive days, most of which we would classify as mid-range decks today. At number 8, it is PHYREXIAN Obliterator. So both JUZUM Jin and Iwamori were 4 mana 5/5s with downside. PHYREXIAN Obliterator, meanwhile, is a 4 mana 5/5 with all kinds of upside. Well, I guess there is one downside here, and that is costing 4 black mana, which really limits the number of decks that can actually cast this. However, if you're a mono black deck, the Obliterator is an absolute monster. Not only does it come with Trample, it also punishes the opponent for damaging it, forcing them to sacrifice a permanent for each point of damage they do to the Obliterator. PHYREXIAN Obliterator gained all of its points in Standard, where it was played in mono black zombie decks. And yeah, the Obliterator isn't a zombie, but if you were a mono black Standard deck, there was no good reason not to run the Obliterator, so that deck did. It doesn't have any points since 2012, but it did recently gain legality in Historic, and while it doesn't have a top 8 in the format yet, some players did bring decks featuring the Obliterator to the Strixhaven Championship, so we could see the Obliterator gaining more points in the future. We'll just have to see. At number 7, it is RATHI Dragon, a 4 mana 5/5 that also has flying, but it has the downside of requiring you to sacrifice 2 mountains. That isn't a small downside, as it means if you play this on turn 4, you go all the way back down to 2 lands, and that could be a problem. Of course, the fact this can just fly over and do 5 damage at a time means that if your opponent doesn't have an answer, they're going to be dead in the near future. And yeah, the red aggro decks that ran RATHI Dragon and Tempest Block Constructed didn't care a whole lot about going down to 2 lands, as RATHI Dragon was the deck's top curve, and most of the other cards in the deck cost 2 or less. It hasn't gained any points outside of Urza's Block Constructed, though. At number 6, it is Rumbling SLUM. This 4 mana 5/5 has a design similar to JUZUM Jin's, only the SLUM damages both players every upkeep instead of just its controller. This makes the SLUM a nice creature for aggressive decks as it presents an impressive stat line as well as an inevitable source of damage. And if you're the aggro deck, that damage is definitely going to be more of a problem for your opponent than you. Rumbling SLUM was played in Gruul aggro and Zoo decks in both Ravnica block constructed and standard. At number 5, it is Advent of the Worm. While not technically a creature that is a 4-mana 5/5, Advent of the Worm was close enough that I thought I would include it here. After all, this 4-mana instant makes a 5/5 with Trample. Because it's an instant, it's sort of like a 4-mana 5/5 with Flash too, which is pretty nice, as a 5/5 can really ambush a whole lot of attacking creatures. So yeah, this is basically a 4-mana 5/5 that is all upside. There isn't any real downside here, short of the fact that a token can just be bounced. It was played in Selesnya aggro decks in both block and standard, in addition to also appearing in Naya decks in the standard format. It doesn't have any points since rotating. At number 4, it is WREN'S run Packmaster. It has the same score as Advent of the Worm, but it had the higher average finish, so I gave it the higher slot on the list. This 4-mana 5/5 does require you to champion an elf, which means you have to exile an elf you have in play. While that might seem like downside, there's actually a bit of upside to be had here too, because if the Packmaster dies, that championed elf returns to the battlefield. This means it's nice insurance against board sweepers and the like, since your opponent will never be able to just wipe your whole board if you have an elf exiled under the Packmaster. The Packmaster also comes with the great upside of being able to churn out wolf creature tokens that it gives Death Touch to. The Packmaster has gained all of its points in elf decks in Standard and Legacy. It isn't really played in current versions of Legacy Elves though, and it doesn't have any points since 2015. At number 3, it is Jade LEECH. This is another 4-mana 5/5 with some very real downside. It makes you pay an additional green mana for any green spell you cast. Obviously, taxing yourself is not ideal, but Jade LEECH's significant success between 2000 and 2002 shows you how much weaker creatures were during Magic's earlier days. In fact, one often sees Jade LEECH end up on a worst creature list, and while it might seem bad today, I think it's important to look at a card in its original context, and if we do that, it's clear that this Leech should never be on any such list, though all the other cards in this cycle should be. They're all just terrible apart from Jade LEECH. The Leech was played as the top curve in red-green aggro decks in both block and standard, where the plan was to quickly curve out, with the Leech coming down last. This helped the deck minimize the downside of the card, since you weren't super likely to need to cast more spells if you curved out that way. And if you did, you were at 4 mana anyway, and the tax wasn't completely backbreaking. Jade LEECH hasn't gained any points since rotating out of standard. At number 2, it is Blastoderm. Blastoderm does come with the downside of fading, but it actually starts with a rather high number of fading counters, which will allow it to attack 3 times, and that's plenty. Creatures don't live much longer than that anyway. Plus, the additional upside of Shroud really has you come out ahead here. The Blastoderm gives you more upside than downside. In both Invasion block and Standard, the Blastoderm was played in red-green aggro decks, alongside Jade LEECH actually. These decks utilized Fires of Yavimaya, which made the downside of fading even more minimal, as you could actually attack with Blastoderm right away instead of having to wait a turn. Blastoderm doesn't have any points since rotating out of Standard. And at number 1, it is POLUKRANOS, World Eater, a 4-mana 5/5 that has no downside at all. In fact, he comes with significant upside as a result of his monstrosity ability. It might be mana intensive, but man, it can really wreck your opponent's board state while also making him even bigger. Using the ability was easier than you'd think too, since POLUKRANOS was usually played in Devotion decks, which sought to abuse Nykthos Shrine to Nyx. Despite all that power though, like most of the cards on this list, POLUKRANOS has yet to see any play outside of block or standard. Well, those are the 10 4-mana 5/5s that have left the biggest impact on competitive Magic. If you want to own any of these powerful creatures, check out the description, where you can find a direct link to the Card Kingdom store for each of them. If you enjoyed this video, please like it and share it. If you want to make sure you catch future MTG Top 10s, don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications. And if you want to catch up on MTG Top 10s I've already done, including several others on creatures' stat lines, you should see a playlist on your screen shortly. Lastly, if you like this YouTube channel, consider subscribing to my other one, Need to Hone History, where I put my PhD in history to use. Thanks for watching.